everyone, I'm Yashasvi, I'm a clinical psychologist. In today's video, I'll be sharing what does the word trauma actually mean. So everyone is on about trauma focused therapy, trauma informed work, but what actually is trauma? So to begin with, uh, so Freud shares this story of, I don't know how to pronounce the names, but the stories goes like there were two lovers. One was Tancred and another one was Clorinda. Both were in love with each other, but they both were from different religion. And there was a war between the armies of both the religious group. And Clorinda came dressed up as knight, and Tancred was not able to recognize Clorinda, and he ended up killing her because Clorinda was dressed in an armor and her face was covered. So Tancred really feels shocked and really regrets it. He buries her body and then they move forward. The army of Tancred moves forward. They enter a mysterious magical forest, and when Tancred was scared, he ended up striking a tree. But the tree started bleeding and a voice came out of the tree which cried out, which was Clorinda's voice, and which cried out that, "Oh look, you have hurt me again." So picking up on this story, Freud tries to explain the concept of trauma. So trauma is taken up from a Greek word which means wound, a physical injury. So this is the Greek root of the word trauma. But Freud transforms the meaning and says that trauma is also a psychical wound. So not something that leaves a scar on the skin, but a tear in the mind's experience of self, time and reality. So when it happens for the first time, like Tancred, who was not aware that he had killed Clorinda, trauma is also, he says, very fast, very shocking. We are not able to process it in the moment. So the person doesn't fully know what happened or how it happened. So for example, if someone comes and shouts at you terribly when you are young, you don't really know what is happening, but it feels too shocking, too fast. Or when you are in the middle of an accident, you really don't know what is going on. So that is the origin, that is where the trauma originates. But it is too fast, it is not recognized as such in that moment, it gets buried. But Freud says that trauma has a language of its own of coming back, of making one realize that somewhere there is a hurt, somewhere there is a tear in the psyche which needs to be looking at. But Freud says that trauma has also a language of its own. Trauma comes out in the words, in ways of repetitions, symptoms, sabotaging behavior, or as nightmares. So I had a patient whose mother was very, very strict with her daughter's sexuality and how it would roll out. So this patient, she would share some dreams, and since I cannot disclose the material of the dreams, but what had turned out common in both the dreams were there were hands involved of strangers which were doing some violent action. So in the dream they were doing violent actions, but as we all know that hands are also supposed and involved in the masturbation. So there I could see and there I could sense that something the dreams are trying to communicate, possibly how the sexuality is experienced as particularly aggressive to explore, to experience. But he says that trauma is something which speaks and it has a language of its own. It comes out in the forms of symbols, it comes out in the forms of metaphors, or it comes out in the forms of dreams and repetitions, and it has a very silent language. So let me take the example of a metaphor. How does trauma speak in a metaphorical language? So since I cannot disclose a lot of history, but there was this patient who had lost someone in a flight accident, and he would always say that he wishes to be successful, he wishes to do really well in his life. So there I could see that this person, now that this person has experienced something, listened to something traumatic happening to his loved one while his loved one was in a flight. Now this particular patient is scared of taking a metaphorical flight towards success, towards coming top in his life, towards becoming successful in his life. So that is a metaphorical flight he could not take, because that flight induced a lot of anxieties. But if he also crashes just like his loved one crashed literally in a flight, but if he ends up crashing metaphorically in that flight. So Freud also elaborates further that trauma is not just an injury to the mind, it is not just a past event. It is a wound which speaks late, not at the time of the original event. So I had seen that there was this patient who would share things which were very overwhelming, which were very striking to me, but to him it all seemed fine. To him it seemed like a normal affair. But the kind of patrons that he was getting into, the kind of people he was dating and he was being in, showed that something had shifted because of what had happened in the past. So he says that trauma is something which does not speak at that moment, but it speaks late, but it does speak. So when Tancred kills Clorinda, everything is fine, he is shocked, but he moves forward. But he ends up killing the tree again. And then the voice of Clorinda cries out. So it is speaking again, but it is speaking late, but it speaks again. This is what Freud also calls repetition compulsion. So we don't remember the wound, we reenact it or dream it or unconsciously repeat it until it finds a voice of its own. So trauma isn't about just what happens, it is also about what gets repeated unknowingly outside the person's awareness or control. So when, let's to give an example, for example, when someone is in an accident, or when there is something happening which feels very confusing, very fragmenting, and something which really overwhelms a person's mind, that is something which traumatizes the mind, and it is the failure of the mind to integrate that event into a self of its own, to give it a comprehension. So Freud says that the key issue is not the violence of the event, but it is the incomprehensibility of it, that the mind couldn't fully absorb when it occurred. So the trauma lives between this gap between the event and the understanding of the event. So the gap between the actual event and how we are understanding that event is where the trauma lives. Until and unless it is given words, until and unless it is understood and processed, is when we will keep repeating the traumatic incident again, is when the trauma will keep reoccurring again and again. So trauma creates a paradox. You are constantly living through it, you are constantly repeating it, but you don't really fully know that you are repeating it. So trauma returns not just as a memory, but as a repetition. So trauma is carried in our body and in our mind. So I have made some notes. So let me see if I have touched on all the points. So you would have also heard these people saying these statements, or your patients coming and saying, I don't know why I keep ending up in the same situation again and again, or I don't know, I hadn't even realized how it affected me until years later. It's not that they are unaware, it is that just that the trauma was never available to consciousness at the time it happened. Like Clorinda voice, it only speaks after the second wounding. So trauma is equal to not something just bad happened, but something about I lived through something, but I cannot fully understand it and I'm still living it. So there was this very curious case that I had seen. So in this particular patient's life, there was a lot of intergenerational stories which were being transferred of women not having a good life, or women living in a very patriarchal household where they were not listened to. They had gone through a lot of abuse that they had tolerated, and could not really escape and get a way out of it. No, now uh, and but generation moving forward, generation wise, things had improved, at least for the younger woman. But this person was so scared of getting into a relationship or dating other people, or would end up dating people, who would really not respect her boundaries, or would not really respect her as an agentic mind in her own right. So, and then when we slowly discovered that, oh, this is what is happening, and of course there were multiple layers attached to it, but at least she could sit and think, okay, maybe this is why this is happening. Oh, these are the stories I didn't know, that I had just registered them, but I had never made sense of them and how I am carrying them in my life moving forward. So trauma has a double telling. So there are two stories in every traumatic experience: the story of the unbearable event itself, and the story of having to survive it. And trauma is not just personal, it becomes part of person's history. It is personal, it is cultural, it is intergenerational. That is why trauma can't just be processed like information. It is something which continues to shape how life is lived. And it is not just what happened then, it is also what is still happening now because of what happened then. And it ends up impacting us in very minute ways. It ends up impacting us in how we breathe, in how we live through life, how we navigate the kind of partners we choose, the kind of choices we make with respect to big decisions like career, or choosing a partner, but also the little decisions that we make throughout the life. And this is what recognizing that also helps us turn that gaze inward and see what role are we playing in our life, and how can we be more agentic of our own lives. So I hope I had made the concept clear. Thank you.